So, in order for you guys to get what you need to get each day, I decided I'm going to record myself today so that you get your lesson and everyone can complete the task that they need to. So, our I can statement for today, Tuesday, November 5th, is I can make connections to my character or the story as I'm reading. I'm going to use an example text, Walk Two Moons, to help demonstrate what you need to do with your own book. You'll be using this paper today. You'll see connections to my story, questions, wonderings that you have while reading, confusions you had while you read, and then why is it important to be an active reader, meaning having a conversation with yourself in your head as you're reading. So we're going to start out by listening to the book Walk Two Moons, and it's an audio recording, so I'm going to play it for you. And I'm going to pause it and stop it as I'm having connections to the story to show my own understanding and thinking.
Two Moons by Sharon Creech. Read by Hope Davis. Copyright 1994 by Sharon Creech. Production copyright 2006 by HarperCollins Publishers. Chapter 1. A Face at the Window. Gramps says that I am a country girl at heart, and that is true. I have lived most of my 13 years in By Banks, Kentucky, which is not much more than a caboodle of houses roosting in a green spot alongside the Ohio River. Just over a year ago, my father plucked me up like a weed and took me and all our belongings. No, that is not true. He did not bring the chestnut tree, the willow, the maple, the hayloft, or the swimming hole, which all belonged to me. And we drove 300 miles straight north and stopped in front of a house in Euclid, Ohio.
Okay, so far I'm thinking to myself, I wonder why this character had to leave. So that's a question or a wondering that I have. Why did her dad pluck her up as she's going through her 13 years here? What is the reason behind that? The author has painted a really good picture of what her house looks like, or her street, by saying a caboodle of houses roosting in a green spot alongside the Ohio River. I don't know if you know what a caboodle is, but it's a thing that keeps makeup organized. So it's very much a step level thing, and so a caboodle of houses meaning them all right in a line next to each other.
No trees? I said. This is where we're going to live? No, said my father. This is Margaret's house. The front door of the house opened, and a lady with wild red hair stood there. I looked up and down the street. The houses were all jammed together like a row of bird houses. In front of each house was a tiny square of grass, and in front of that was a thin gray sidewalk running alongside a gray road. Where's the barn? I asked.
Again, I'm stopping here because I had a connection. The way the houses are crammed together reminded me of when I lived in Royal Oak, which is near Detroit, Michigan. And the houses there were very much close together and didn't have very big yards.
Asked. The river, the swimming hole. Oh, Sal, my father said. Come on, there's Margaret. He waved to the lady at the door. We have to go back. I forgot something. The lady with the wild red hair opened the door and came out onto the porch. In the back of the closet, I said, under the floorboards. I put something there and I've got to have it. Don't be a goose. Come and see Margaret. I did not want to see Margaret. I stood there, looking around, and that's when I saw the face pressed up against an upstairs window next door. It was...
Here I'm going to stop because I'm thinking, did Sal really leave something behind, or is she just saying that because she's afraid of what is going to come next? So that's a wondering I have.
A round girl's face, and it looked afraid. I didn't know it then, but that face belonged to Phoebe Winterbottom, a girl who had a powerful imagination, who would become my friend, and who would have many peculiar things happen to her. Not long ago, when I was locked in a car with my grandparents for 6 days, I told them the story of Phoebe, and when I finished telling them, or maybe even as I was telling them, I realized that the story of Phoebe was like the plaster wall in our old house in Bybanks, Kentucky. My father started chipping away at a plaster wall in the living room of our house in Bybanks shortly after my mother left us one April morning. Our house was an old farmhouse that my parents had been restoring, room by room, each night.
Now, I haven't had my mom leave, but I have um, restored different parts of a house. And so I can make a connection to the character in the fact that it takes a lot of work to restore things and a lot of dedication.
As he waited to hear from my mother, he chipped away at that wall. On the night that we got the bad news that she was not returning, he pounded and pounded on that wall with a chisel and hammer. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he came up to my room. I was not asleep. He led me downstairs and showed me what he had found. Hidden behind the wall was a brick fireplace. The reason that Phoebe's story reminds me of that plaster wall and the hidden fireplace is that beneath Phoebe's story was another one, mine.
So Sal sounds like a very complicated character, and I am wondering if we're going to find out more about her layers as we continue reading the story, and if I'll have more connections to the story. So I shared my thinking out loud of those connections and wonderings, but if I was you and I was reading the story, I would be putting those connections and wonderings right here on the sheet. You'll see each of them are labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so you need 3 to 4 connections and 1 to 3 questions you have while reading. You might not always find the answer right on the page as you read, which is actually a good thing because it means that you're thinking deeply and the answer isn't quick to be found. Any confusions I have while reading, which is a little bit different than questions you have, I would put in the square space there. Confusions might be, what do they mean by caboodle? What do they mean by chipping away or the plaster walls? Maybe you're not familiar with that vocabulary. Something that pops into your head that you just have no idea what they're talking about, that would be what you would put for confusions. Okay? So I'm going to continue reading the story. We're going to move on to chapter 2, and then I'm going to have you guys think about why it's important to be an active reader.
Chapter 2. The Chickabiddy Starts a Story. It was after all the adventures of Phoebe that my grandparents came up with a plan to drive from Kentucky to Ohio, where they would pick me up, and then the three of us would drive 2,000 miles west to Lewiston, Idaho. This is how I came to be locked in a car with them for nearly a week. It was not a trip I was eager to take, but it was one I had to take.
So another wondering, I wonder why she had to take that trip with her grandparents. Does it have anything to do with her mother leaving in the previous chapter? We'll find out.
Gramps had said, "We'll see the whole ding-dong country." Graham squeezed my cheeks and said, "This trip will give me a chance to be with my favorite chickabiddy again." I am, by the way, their only chickabiddy.
So I can connect to this because on my mom's side of the family, I was the only granddaughter. So that kind of is the same as the only chickabiddy.
My father said that Graham couldn't read maps worth a hill of beans and that he was grateful that I had agreed to go along with them and help them find their way. I was only 13, and although I did have a way with maps, it was not really because of that skill that I was going, nor was it to see the whole ding-dong country that Graham and Gramps were going. The real reasons were buried beneath piles and piles of unsaid things. Some of the real reasons were, number 1, Graham and Gramps wanted to see Mama, who was resting peacefully in Lewiston, Idaho. Number 2, Graham and Gramps knew that I wanted to see Mama, but that I was afraid to. Number 3, Dad wanted to be alone with the redhead Margaret cadaver. He had already seen Mama, and he had not taken me. Also, although this wasn't as important, Dad did not trust Gram and Gramps to behave themselves along the way unless they had me with them. Dad said that if they tried to go on their own, he would save everyone a lot of time and embarrassment by calling the police and having them arrested before they even left the driveway. It might sound a bit extreme for a man to call the police on his own tottery old parents, but when my grandparents got in a car, trouble
Confusion. I wonder what the word tottery means.
just naturally followed them like a filly trailing behind a mare. My grandparents, Hiddle, were my father's parents, full up to the tops of their heads with goodness and sweetness, and mixed in with all that goodness and sweetness was a large dash of peculiarity. This combination made them interesting to know, but you could never predict what they would do or say. Once it was settled that the three of us would go, the journey took on an alarming, expanding need to hurry that was like a walloping great thundercloud assembling around me. During the week before we left, the sound of the wind was, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." And at night, even the silent darkness whispered, "Rush, rush, rush." I did not think we would ever leave, and yet I did not want to leave. I did not really expect to survive the trip.
Here I wonder if she's thinking figuratively when she says, I don't think I was going to survive the trip. Obviously, she will survive the trip, but I think it's more of a mental state. So that's a wondering that I have as I'm reading. I'm going to stop right there because I want you to be able to read some of your own book. But as you're reading today, you're going to be making connections to your story, questions and wonderings that you have as you read, confusions you had while you read, and then finally you're going to answer the last question with, why is it important to be an active reader and have a conversation in your head as you're reading? Obviously, it's going to have to do with your understanding of the story, and if you are having that conversation, you are partaking and showing your comprehension. And so it's an important thing to be doing. So you're going to explain that piece of it when you finish. I expect that this paper is finished by the end of the hour today. If it's not, you're going to finish it at home using your own book. If you have any questions while you're working on it, you can raise your hand and I will come over and help you. But we have a lot of work to accomplish, and I expect everyone to be on task. Thanks.